Hello, it's my privilege to welcome everyone to our webinar on chelation therapy. Today it's my privilege to present my former program director, Gervasio Lamas, or Tony Lamas, who's now chairman of medicine at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami Beach, Florida, and chief of Columbia University Division of Cardiology at Mount Sinai, professor of medicine, Columbia University Medical Center. Tony will be talking about the TACT trials, so it's my pleasure to introduce Tony.
Roy, it's a pleasure. You're talking about a long time now since I was your program director, but you know, time passes quickly. So what I wanted to do is to discuss the trial to assess chelation therapy and go through our results, which are really quite interesting, and then where we are and where we go next. And this lecture very much is the kind of lecture that I give to cardiologists. And the reason that I say that is because those of you who have been practicing chelation or who are interested in chelation are quite receptive to the idea that this is actually a beneficial therapy, whereas cardiology for a long time was very, very, very opposed to the idea of chelation therapy. And as you know, there were even organizations that were devoted to preventing research on chelation therapy. So let's let me dismiss some of these little things. Why don't we start? And you know, the way that one has to think about TACT really is in the context of a metaphor. And the metaphor I'm giving you is the black swan theory. A black swan event is an outlier. It lies outside the realm of regular expectations. It carries an extreme impact, and then retrospectively we find reasons for it. And this is a great book. On the bottom of your screen you can see The Black Swan, the Impact of the Highly Improbable. And that's exactly what TACT was. TACT was supposed to show that this molecule, EDTA, in fact, did not do anything and maybe even was harmful. And that's what I thought would be the most likely outcome of this study. And instead, you'll see, as you'll see, and I'm sure you know, TACT showed exactly the opposite. This kind of event is unusual in clinical trials, and it really is a black swan, and it has to be presented in just the right way to cardiologists so that they can step back from their emotions and look at the data. So why was it such a surprise? Well, all the information that would suggest that TACT was going to be positive has existed for a long time, but it's been captive in silos. The first silo, of course, is CAM, Complementary and Alternative Medicine, in multiple journals, case reports and case series over and over again. But in fact, cardiologists and conventional medicine practitioners do not read this, and when they read it, they don't believe it. A little bit more serious in terms of neglecting real data were data that the epidemiologists were putting out on metals and cardiovascular events. That is, it's been known for a long time that, in fact, if you have lead in your blood, lead in your bones, cadmium in your blood or urine, that you are much more likely to undergo and have a cardiovascular event. So, but the connection from going from that point to the point of saying, well, look, maybe what we should do is try to get out the lead and the cadmium, simply was not made. That information stayed in the epidemiology silo. Diabetologists for a long time also have been saying that metals are necessary for the formation of advanced glycation end products, which are these complex linked glucose molecules that are linked to proteins and linked to fats, etc., that are thought to cause the gumming up of the basement membrane and many of the complications of diabetes. But that stayed within the diabetes basic science arena and ultimately was never applied. And then finally, as cardiologists, we've been dealing with coronary disease in the same way for a long time. So if somebody has atherosclerosis, we look for a mechanical way to treat it. We give antiplatelets, and we reduce cholesterol. And that's it. And we've been stuck there since I can remember. And when you take away mechanical, take away platelets, and take away cholesterol, what happens? Well, you know what? As cardiologists, we're not interested. And the information stayed captive in these silos of information. So I think we need to consider what the implications of TACT are. And the principal implication is that environmental pollutants are a modifiable risk factor for coronary disease. And while that may be hard to really process because it's a little bit like global warming, you just don't want to know about this. The easiest way to think about it is exactly what this gentleman is doing. He is sticking particulate, metals, and other pollutants down directly into his lungs. And we know for a fact that that's not healthy, it causes disease, and that diabetic patients are an especially vulnerable population. What about these two particularly bad actors, lead and cadmium? And the reason that I stick with lead and cadmium is that EDTA is a great chelator of both of these. Lead is associated with hypertension, stroke, MI, and mortality. Its principal storage is in bone. Once in bone, the half-life is 30 years. Cadmium is associated with coronary disease, cerebrovascular disease, and particularly peripheral artery disease. Principal storage is in kidneys, liver, and lung. The half-life is 30 years. So you get a little cadmium in you, it's going to be there for a long time unless you live to be 300 or so. And do we have a lead and cadmium problem in this country? Well, let's take a look at lead. Lead and automobiles are really linked. We pulled out thousands, maybe millions of tons of lead and stuck it in our gasoline for decades and decades. When leaded gasoline was no longer manufactured, what happened? Well, we didn't ball all that lead up and stick it back in the ground. It's still in our environment. Our cars still are full of lead. We all have, unless you have an electric car, and I actually don't know what those batteries are made of. We have lead batteries, and in fact, lead and cadmium are both used in the cosmetics industry, and they're really pollutants. They actually are used in coloring, but in that case, they really are pollutants. Cigarette smoke is rich in cadmium. This nickel-cadmium rechargeable Duracell battery eventually has to be disposed of, and in fact, we end up drinking it at some point or another. Even children are still heavily exposed to lead. This was in USA Today about 2 weeks ago. I mean, no, less than that, maybe 10 days ago, which is that artificial turf is full of little crumbs of rubber that hold the little artificial blades together. And those rubber crumbs are actually from reused tires, old automobile tires, which are completely polluted with lead. And so, again, there are many fields now that are closed. There's 15,000 fields over the U.S. The kids play on that have artificial turf. Lead is with us. It's going to be with us. So what happens? Well, these metals increase oxidative stress. They promote inflammation. They interfere with calcium signaling. They affect endothelial function. They increase blood pressure levels. They induce renal dysfunction. And in fact, they even induce epigenetic changes. Cadmium induces histone hydroxymethylation. So this is now getting into the genetics of it. Advanced glycation end products are mediators of complications of diabetes, as I spoke with you before. And if you go to the second bullet point, age is formation or metal-catalyzed oxidation reaction. Reactive oxygen species and free metal ions are key participants in the formation of ages. Chelators have been identified as potent inhibitors of cross-linking of proteins by glucose, and the chemistry of Aegis-forming reactions can be inhibited in vitro by chelators, including EDTA. So with the background really of EDTA chelation being used by alternative medicine practitioners, Congress, interested in knowing what their constituents were doing and what was the public health implications, and NHLBI somewhat resistant to this, ultimately, NCAM and NHLBI released a $30 million RFA for an efficacy trial of EDTA chelation therapy. We competed and won the award, and the award date was well over 10 years ago. It was August 2002. And we enrolled the first patient in September of 2003. And this study really was truly a saga. In August 2012, we unblinded TACT. I can tell you that most of us expected TACT to be negative. At Duke, the statisticians, you would not want to play poker with them. They are completely, they just don't give away any information. And we keeled over when we saw the results. Now let's talk about the design a little bit. When I did my due diligence to find out what in fact a chelation practitioner was doing when he gave IV chelation to a patient, I found that invariably oral high-dose vitamins and minerals were being given. So that complicated things because we needed to do a factorial trial. So in blue you can see that we can compare IV chelation and to red, which is IV placebo chelation, right? But we're also randomizing oral high-dose vitamins versus oral placebo vitamins, and that's the comparison in light blue to orange. And the most interesting comparison, of course, is what at the top in blue and light blue, IV chelation plus oral high-dose vitamins would be the patients who, in the past, would leave my office taking their aspirin and their statin, maybe a beta blocker, maybe an ACE inhibitor, and go down the street to receive IV chelation and oral high-dose vitamins, versus the patients who just saw me receive their standard therapy and didn't go on and receive chelation and oral high-dose vitamins in orange. So this is active-active versus placebo-placebo. What did we give? Well, I think all of you know what's in the TACT infusions, so I'm not going to belabor it, but we used disodium EDTA 3 grams, ascorbic acid 7 grams, B vitamins, a little procaine, a little heparin. The placebo infusions were essentially normal saline. We administered 55,222 infusions over the course of over 134 sites in the US and Canada. The oral treatments, the oral vitamins, was a 28-component multivitamin, multimineral mixture. Now, what does EDTA do? And again, this is not new to, I suspect, many of you, but if you give a TACT infusion and you measure the urine, you measure 6 hours of urine afterwards, you will find that urine lead is increased over 4,000% over baseline, and urine cadmium is increased over 800% over baseline. Really a powerful drug, EDTA, to take out 2 extremely toxic elements. We studied patients who were at least age 50. They'd had a myocardial infarction at least 6 weeks prior, and their creatinine was 2 or better. So they had, at the very worst, fair renal function. The primary endpoint of the study was a composite of death, MI, stroke, coronary revasc, or hospitalization for angina. We also looked at a major secondary endpoint of cardiovascular death, MI, or stroke, and I will show you all of that information. These are the 1,708 patients that we enrolled, and as you can see, starting at the top, the median age is 65. Not that many women joined the study. About 37% of the patients were diabetic. About 3/4 of the patients were on statins. And then either aspirin, clopidogrel, or warfarin was in over 90% of patients. And the LDL was not bad. It was less than 100. As I had said before, we gave a total of 55,222 infusions. 65% completed all 40 infusions, and 76% completed at least 30. We had more patients withdrawing consent than we wanted, but we still had patients who had clinical events, and all the patients had their vital status assessed using the national death registries. Because remember, we have social security numbers, etc., and permission from the patients to look at the death registry at the end of the trial. So this is the primary endpoint results. Now remember, it's a factorial trial, so now you are looking only at IV chelation versus IV placebo. You're not factoring in the effect of the vitamins at all. So if you just look at chelation versus placebo, there is an 18% relative reduction in risk. That's a hazard ratio of 0.82 with a significant p-value, and this is a positive study. The number needed to treat, so in one of the important numbers that you look at is how many people do I have to treat to prevent an event? Here, the 5-year number needed to treat is 18. For a statin in a similar population, it's sort of in the 20s. And we found an interesting finding that patients with diabetes seem to have greater benefit than those individuals who did not have diabetes, as you can see right here. This P for interaction means that EDTA interacted with the diagnosis of diabetes. So the first conclusion was that EDTA-based chelation therapy reduced combined cardiovascular events in post-MI patients treated with optimal medical therapy. The 5-year number needed to treat was 18. Now let's look at the vitamins. The vitamins, when we published this in the Annals of Internal Medicine, there were editorials. I think there were several editorials saying that we should never do vitamin studies again. Well, you can see that there's a difference. In fact, the difference is there's a hazard ratio of 0.89. That's an 11% difference. We don't have the statistical power to discern that difference with any precision, so the p-value is not significant. But I want you to remember to keep track of that sort of 10% benefit of vitamins, because you'll see that it tracks over and over again every time it's mixed with EDTA chelation. So let's look actually at the 4 factorial groups, and this is really what TACT was about, right? Ultimately, the comparison of placebo-placebo with active-active. So this is placebo infusions and placebo vitamins. Next is placebo infusions and high-dose vitamins. So there's a tiny little bump down. Then EDTA chelation and placebo vitamins. Remember, it was a relative reduction in risk of 18% with EDTA. So it's a little better than just vitamins alone. And what happens when you combine them? These are the patients who would leave my office and go and get chelation and vitamins, right? Well, they did a lot better than the ones who just stayed with me. In fact, what you can see is that there was a hazard ratio of 0.74, or a 26% reduction in the combined primary endpoint with a p-value that is quite significant, 0.016. So the strength here is that this is all-comer post-MI patients, age 50 or older, with a reasonably good kidney function. This is an enormous finding. 75% of these patients are already on statins. Over 90% are on aspirin, Plavix, or warfarin. You can't beat this. This is an extraordinary finding. The actual 5-year Kaplan-Meier estimate for the reduction in events is 8.3%. In a cardiology study, this is big. If you look at the studies that were being touted in the recent American College of Cardiology, you're talking about an absolute reduction of maybe 1%, 2%. This is very big, but we don't have a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry behind us. So conclusion 2 is that high-dose oral vitamins and minerals demonstrate an 11% reduction in cardiovascular events, which is not statistically significant, yet this event reduction carries over to the combination of EDTA chelation plus oral vitamins. Conclusion 3 is that compared with optimal medical therapy plus placebo, optimal medical therapy plus active-active demonstrates an enhanced reduction in clinical events. Again, a hazard ratio of 0.74 with a highly significant p-value. This reduction is of sufficient magnitude to be clinically significant. The 5-year number needed to treat is 12. This is getting very big because just to keep it in context, remember these people are on statins, but statin therapy for secondary prevention 5-year NNT is 16. So this is on top of the reduction that statins give. So it's pretty striking. I mean, really striking. We analyzed that we pre-specified when we designed the trial that we would analyze patients with diabetes at baseline. And the definition of diabetes was either that it was self-reported, the patient said they had diabetes, or they were taking medicines for diabetes, or they had a fasting blood sugar of 126, and we had the pleasure of telling them that they had diabetes, and they were unaware of it. So this is the primary endpoint by infusion arm only. So remember, we are now, again, excluding the vitamins. What does the chelation do? And you can see the first thing you should notice is that you now get much higher on the event curve, right? Diabetics have many more events than do non-diabetics. And when you treat them with chelation, it's extraordinary. There is nothing else like this in diabetes. There's a relative reduction in risk of 41%, a p-value that tells you that you have a 2 in 10,000 chance of having this, the probability of having this occur by chance. The number needed to treat is 6.5 over 5 years. It is extraordinary. Now when we look at the no diabetes, and it's a little different, but there are 2 points that I want to make. The first point is, notice that patients who don't have diabetes have far fewer events than those who have diabetes. We know this, but sometimes it's nice to see because it kind of confirms where you are with your patient selection. And there doesn't seem to be much effect here. This is a little bit complicated because there are also some subgroups here that actually do benefit, specifically patients with anterior myocardial infarctions. But what I want to point out is that the patients who have diabetes and are treated with chelation look very similar to those who don't have diabetes at all. And so much so that you can do this very nice animated superimposition, and bingo, the curves superimpose as if we had removed the vascular effect of diabetes by using chelation therapy. An extraordinary finding. Nothing else like this in diabetes. Nothing. Remember that the milestone that drug companies now have to reach when developing new anti-diabetes drugs is that they don't increase cardiovascular events. Not that they decrease it, that they don't increase it. This decreases it. What about the holy grail of clinical trials? That's death by infusion arm. And so this is total death from all causes, and this is placebo. Here's active treatment, and there is a 43% reduction in death with a p-value of 0.01. 1 in 100 that this is due to chance. Now let's look at some of the combined endpoints and some of the individual endpoints in the patients with diabetes. Here we are with the major secondary endpoint. So these are hard endpoints, right? Cardiovascular death, heart attack, or stroke. A reduction by 40%. Here's myocardial infarction. These are all adjudicated by non-investigators that are expert adjudicators. Patient had a heart attack, patient had no heart attack. That's all they do all day. Reduced by half. And coronary revascularization, reduced by about a third. So pretty amazing. Conclusion 4 is that patients with diabetes demonstrate enhanced efficacy with EDTA chelation. Compared, with placebo, EDTA-treated patients demonstrated a 41% reduction in cardiovascular endpoints, with a 5-year number needed to treat of 6.5 rounded to 7, and a 43% reduction in total mortality, with a 5-year number needed to treat of 12. Again, just to give you context, statins for secondary prevention in diabetes. For major coronary events, the 5-year NNT is 15. We're nowhere near there. We are twice as good. Now let's go and look at the 4 factorial groups. Remember, we weren't even looking at adding vitamins there. And what happens? You see the same kind of pattern emerge. And when you get rid of the 2 intermediate curves and you compare placebo versus EDTA chelation and high-dose vitamins, active, you see that there's a 51% reduction, a hazard ratio of 0.49 with a p-value of less than 1 in 1,000. Again, nothing like this in diabetes. Nothing. Nothing's been seen like this. Now, was this due to control of glucose? We know that that's not the case, right? Because the trials of glucose control, for sure, have not yielded any kind of benefit like this. We did not, however, collect hemoglobin A1C, but there was no significant treatment-related change in insulin or oral hypoglycemic therapies over the course of the study, and the fasting blood glucose change from baseline to last follow-up was not significant. In fact, it was identical in chelation and placebo. What about the treatment? Anti-diabetes treatment, does that modify the effect of EDTA? Well, it turns out that the sicker the patient, that is the insulin-requiring patients, are the ones that have the greatest benefit. So here we have a treatment, in fact, that is best when the patients are sickest. That's extraordinary. So the benefit of vitamin therapy added to EDTA chelation was magnified in the subgroup of patients with diabetes with a number needed to treat of 6 to prevent 1 primary event over 5 years. This effect size really is sufficient to put us at a crossroads. So how do we interpret these findings? What are the next steps? Well, we need to now consider, really I think as true, the concept that environmental pollutants are a modifiable risk factor for cardiovascular disease. We gave a chelating agent. We know that it pulls out lead and cadmium. We know lead and cadmium are vasculotoxic, and we know that the patients did better. And the patients who are most vulnerable to oxidative stress, diabetics, did the best of all. So there we are. We need to focus on TACT as heralding the potential rise of a disruptive pharmacology. That is, it's a pharmacology that is based on extracting toxins. This is something that ACAM has been doing for decades. But my world looks upon it as something new. We need to replicate these clinical results in the population with diabetes and prior myocardial infarction. Why do we need to replicate it? If we had a negative study, nobody would ask us to replicate it. We need to replicate it because it's chelation. You have to be honest about it. That's all that it is. And we need to work out mechanisms, particularly the metal oxidative stress hypothesis. Mechanisms are great for cardiologists. We love mechanisms. The mechanisms will change every year, but we love mechanisms. And so this led us to submit an application to the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute for TACT2, which will be a replicative trial of IV chelation plus oral vitamins versus double placebo in 1,200 post-MI diabetic patients. And now the black swan comes back. So what are we going to do? We are going to use these two interventions as our TACT2 interventions. Those are the interventions that had the greatest efficacy and the interventions that were safe, completely safe. And that's where we're going to go. We need a positive study. We need a positive study to prove the concept, to move chelation from where it is now, about to win the race. We got to get it across the finish line. And that's why I've been giving this lecture to different sites, different universities, recruiting sites. Over 100 sites have now told me that they will participate in TACT2. And this study will be very tightly monitored, tightly watched, and we are still recruiting sites. So I welcome people to contact me if they think that they want to be involved in a study of this nature. And again, I thank you for your attention and for the privilege of speaking with you.
Dr. Lamas will now entertain any questions that anyone may have. Please put them in your chat box and we will forward over to him. Dr. Lamas, you have the question, is the funding already in place and how much has it been allotted for?
The funding is not in place. We submitted the application in February. It will be reviewed in May or June, and then it will receive a score. I hope that we get a fundable score. If we get a fundable score, then it goes to NHLBI Council, which is in the fall. And then after that, funding would be assigned. So we are not going to be able to enroll anyone until about a year from now. Actually, more than a year from now. Things move very slowly, unfortunately.
Another question is, how do I become a site investigator and what is the contact information to do so?
I think the easiest thing is to shoot me an email and then I'll put you in touch with my assistants. And if you want to distribute my email, Liz, it's gervasio.lamas@msmc.com.
Okay, well, we will include that in the follow-up email.
Okay.
Then we also have another question. When will we know it's a go?
It's like everything else. You only know it's a go when you cash a check and it clears. But I think that we will have a good idea if it's a go on this cycle after the review. So probably sometime in the summer, we will have an idea if it is a fundable score. We do have, believe it or not, we actually have a lot of friends at NHLBI, and in particular NCAM, which has changed its name to NCCIH. I mean, a lot of friends. A lot of people who, for years, you know, thought that this study was going to be negative, like me. And then we've lived with the data for years now. We unblinded in 2012. And we have turned this data over and over and over, and we've looked at every crevice, and it is what it is. So we think that it is our responsibility as health professionals to make sure this thing gets across the finish line, because it's going to save a lot of people, and it'll come out of the shadows. So there are a lot of people at NIH, and in particular NIH they've been really solid. Once they looked at the data, they were true scientists. They weren't bothered by previous bias. They turned the page and said, okay, this thing is positive, now what?
Okay. Next question is, will the placebo in TACT2 still contain 1.2% dextrose or normal saline?
The 1.2% dextrose, the purpose of it actually is that it helps in blinding for the following way. Vitamin C, the 7 grams of vitamin C are sort of viscous, and they're slightly yellow. So the syringe that is shipped, and you can't ship the full solution together with the EDTA, the vitamin C, and all the other vitamins and whatnot. They end up being inactive after about a day, and that's the time it takes to FedEx it. So the EDTA comes in a syringe. You get a bag. You get an EDTA syringe or placebo, and you get a vitamin C syringe that is yellow or placebo. So you can't tell that the vitamin C is yellow if it's the real one. Okay, so that blinds the color. The other problem is that the vitamin C is viscous. And so we needed a viscous placebo. And that's where it comes in. It's a bit of D50 in that syringe, and it makes it pretty much as viscous as the vitamin C. So yeah, it'll have some glucose, because otherwise we have to use hypertonic saline, and that'll bring criticism some other way. If you look at it, pardon me, 1.2% glucose, which is I think 6 grams, that's like having you know, a sip of Coke. I mean, once a week. It's okay. Nobody died from a sip of Coke once a week, I think. Maybe they did. But it's from the aluminum, not from the sugar.
All right, next question. In clinical practice, how many infusions do you recommend to see the full benefits of chelation? 40 or more or less?
Well, that's interesting because I only know what we studied. That's the frustration of clinical trials. We asked patients to do 40. Now, we did do an analysis of patients who had only done 30, and there was benefit. I think ultimately it will have to do with how much metal has been removed, but we were not funded to do that. This next study will likely have a mechanistic arm in which we will be able to see you know, the likelihood of benefit maybe is related to what your stored metal load is. When you stop infusing, perhaps, has to do with when your stored metal load gets down to a minimum. We don't know any of that. So right now, my goal to patients, I say, listen, you know, go for 40 infusions.
Okay. Last question that I have here is, where can we get slides from this presentation? And my guess that we're supplying those to?
I mean, I can send them to you.
Okay, so we will include those in our follow-up email as well.
Sure.
Oh, it looks like we have one more question here. Oh, Nicholas Anhorn says, thank you so much, Dr. Lamas, for all your hard work.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. I think we will really make a tremendous impact like I said, this is sort of the healthcare global warming. It's the knowledge that removing these elements truly improves health is going to revolutionize cardiovascular care.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess we'll wrap it up for this evening, and we will send you off your follow-up email early tomorrow morning, and the archive should be ready by the end of this week.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you very much to the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Lamas.
Thanks.